for the West. And good afternoon and good evening to the rest of us here. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Space Economics Seminar for session, which is organized by the Ownership Project at the Harvard Business School and the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna. And we are thrilled to have over 174 people who registered. We'll see how many actually show up from 44 countries. So we're very excited that for this new field, there is so much interest. So we're super, super excited. Very quickly, the purpose of this seminar is to apply the tools of economics to challenges and opportunities in space. We have a wide range of topics that we're interested in. First, ownership and governance in space, since we are partnering with the ownership project at HBS, but many other topics such as public-private partnership, government intervention, innovation, and a number of other things. We will meet monthly. And we'll bring together, on one hand, we have academics, but we also have one session this semester given by a practitioner who's going to talk about ownership on the moon. And the idea is to share research, to exchange ideas, and to build a global community to do research in this field. What I would ask from you is to engage actively before the seminar by reading the paper, and then in the seminar to give feedback to the presenters at the end of the presentation. And then basically to make an effort to be part of this community, because we want to create a community. So it's not just about presenting research, but basically starting collaborations, starting publications, conference panels, and things like that. With that, I will actually give the floor to the rest of the organizers. And I will pass the baton to HBS, and maybe Niha would like to say a few words maybe about the ownership project and how he's involved in this seminar. I
Oh,
don't see
great.
you.
So my name is Nyanha Shea. I'm here at Harvard Business School and co-direct the Ownership Project. And the Ownership Project aims to explore how structuring ownership of key parts of the economy can help businesses and communities better address pressing societal challenges. And also, I think for us, more generally interested in the question of how to uphold sort of important human values, sort of broadly understood. So that might be everything from freedom, dignity, to democratic values as well. And we were very excited at the chance to partner on the Space Economics Seminar um, for two reasons. I think one of our areas of interest is trying to understand how to structure enterprise ownership. And I think in thinking about enterprises in the context of space, that opens up some interesting possibilities that may move beyond sort of the traditional ways in which we think about ownership when we think about sort of traditionally structured companies, especially given that it's sort of global in nature. So that's sort of one thing that we would love to study and explore and sort of help promote that discussion. And the second one is part of our work also is on the question of how should we think about the ownership of resources. And I think space for us presents a fascinating place because ownership of resources is up for grabs, debated, contested. And so from that, what can we again sort of help to learn, but also help shape that discussion in a way that'll be beneficial for society at large? And also, what do the answers to questions in space tell us about how we might think about ownership here on Earth? So very much excited to be joining all of you and being part of this. So thank you very much and looking forward to learning a lot. Tony, I don't know if you want to say anything from your position in the ownership project.
No, I think just reiterating everything you say about how happy we are at the Ownership Project at Harvard Business School to be participating, partnering with ESPI, and how important we think that this topic is. And so we look forward to all the conversation.
Thank you. And Matt, would you like to add something also from the HBS side? And I guess since you were mentioning that every company needs to have a space strategy, maybe every scholar should have a space strategy. I don't know.
That might be an ambitious reach, but thank you, Iwana. Thanks for everybody for being here. It is so great to see so many friendly faces on this call. Some really good friends. So thanks for being here, everybody. And those of you we haven't met for joining this group. We're really excited to build on economic research in space, something I think many of us think could deliver real value to people. And most of all, I want to thank Ioana, who has really done a ton of heavy lifting to make this come together and bring this incredible group into conversation. So thanks very much, Ioana.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Mattia from ESPI, who's the partner of HBS in this seminar. Mattia, would you like to say something from the ESPI organizer
Yeah,
side?
thank you. Thank you so much for the floor, Joanna, and thank you also echoing Matt for all the heavy lifting that you've done bring this together. Maybe just to resonate with the fact that I am as well extremely happy to see all these faces interested in the topic. I think being here at ESPI, we also want to create these sort of platforms, offer these sort of platforms for an exchange of views, ideas, methodologies, and also the state of the art when it comes to economic research applied to space. It's part of our mandate in terms of our educational activities, but also, I think, more importantly, in view of our future research. I'm probably not the only one thinking that I think economic research applied to space is very exciting, but I think it's also an area which has been fairly stale over the past maybe years or decades, in the sense that I think we could definitely, compare to some other sectors, do with some new methodological experimentation, as well as with some new sort of angles to assess, the benefits of space in the wider economy. So I'm very much looking forward to listening to the presentation today, but also to all the presentations of the academics going forward. And I am very confident this platform can grow its reach and impact in the years to come.
Thank you, Mattia. So I will go through a set of rules before we start, because we are a large group of people. So just to make sure that we everything goes well, I think I would very much like if everyone would keep the microphone muted unless you are called on. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat. After the presentation, I will go through them and I'll ask you to ask the question, but just put them in the chat. And please don't interrupt the speaker during the talk, because it's a large number of people. So even if you have a clarifying question, if there are too many, and they won't be able to go through the presentation. Also, the session is being recorded. We will post the session online. I already sent you a link to a Google form that asks you to tell us which of the sessions you're going to this fall semester, and also to tick the box that you agree to be videotaped. Tony will put in the chat the same Google form. If you did not check that one, the one that goes through every single date of the seminar, please do it now, because we need your agreement to be recorded. So just wanted to make sure that you can't attend these sessions if you don't tick those boxes. I'm sorry, we have GDPR and other rules. And I want to emphasize something, that we encourage any questions that are related to the paper and its arguments. And, I'm sure we all would like to discuss a meaning live universe and everything, but we're just not going to do it in the 1-hour seminar. So I will address only the questions that are related to the paper. With that, again, the link is in the chat. Please feel free to fill out that Google form. Is very easy to fill out. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to my lovely two presenters. We're very excited to have two scholars from Europe for our first session. And we have a senior professor and a very young scholar who's a PhD student. They're both from Dresden University of Technology. And Lars is a professor of business administration, and he is a finance guy, so he does finance and financial technology. And I know from him that was Daniel who dragged him to this side of the economics of space, and now he also writes on in the economics of space. But he had appointments in Bremen, research fellowships at the Max Planck Institute, visiting roles at Berkeley, Stanford, Duke, Georgetown. Well, obviously he likes to travel. And his research has been featured in The Economist, in Foreign Policy. Daniel is a PhD student. He's a younger scholar who's co-authoring this paper, and he works on the economics and societal implication of space industry and satellite data in finance. And the first paper we are going to present in this seminar is called How Geopolitical Competition and Commercialization Shape Public Support for Space Funding. The paper is available on the ESPI website. On the seminar side, you will find a link there, and you can find the full draft. So I don't know if Lars or Daniel will present, but feel free to share the screen. Lars, and the floor is all yours. You have 30 minutes. I will stop you after 30 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and the kind invitation to speak here at the Space Economics Seminar. And it's a particular honor for Daniel and me to be the inaugural speakers of this seminar series. So the paper we present today examines how geopolitical competition and space commercialization affect public support for space funding, as you already mentioned. Okay, so I hope our colleagues from HBS are feeling intellectually resilient this morning, because we'd like to begin our presentation with a quote from the current US president. And let's take a quick listen.
And it came down so gently, and then it wrapped those arms around it. And it held it, and just like you hold your baby at night, your little baby. And it was a beautiful thing to see. I said, who else can do that? Can Russia do it? No. Can China do it? No. Can the United States do it?
So opening with a quote from Donald Trump might seem a little bit provocative, but we chose it because actually it serves as a perfect illustration of the first two key topics we explore in our study. So what did Trump actually say here? At around 2 a.m. on the night of the 2024 election, as the first media outlets began calling the race in his favor, Trump took the stage for his victory speech. And in referencing to the first successful catch of the Starship rocket, he made the following remark: who else can do it? Can Russia do it? No. Can China do it? No. So this is a textbook example of what we call pure comparison. And Trump is in fact far from alone. We have a table in our paper revealing a striking pattern that political leaders across multiple countries routinely invoke national pride in space achievements, only to immediately justify the need for further, often larger investments in space. And the logic here is often simple. What they say is, because country X is doing this in space, we need to do it too, and do it even better. So this kind of geopolitical comparative rhetoric isn't in fact surprising. The link between space and geopolitics is both historic and highly relevant even today. Space offers direct and indirect geopolitical influence. Directly, on the one hand, through military and strategic functions, think Starlink in Ukraine or weather forecasting in Operation Desert Storm, but also indirectly, space success signals national prestige, especially in countries like China and India, where it's tied to aspirations of global superpower status. Lincoln Hines has recently shown that many Chinese citizens view space achievements as national victories, but projecting geopolitical power in space requires also public investments. And that in turn requires public support. And here lies a problem. Space consistently ranks low in citizens' priorities, and people tend to vastly overestimate how much is spent. However, when informed of the true much smaller budget, citizens' support tends to rise. But to complicate things even further, citizens often romanticize past support for space. Yet Roger Launius, the former chief historian of NASA, shows that even in the 1960s, support for NASA was low, except for the year of the moon landing. In short, public generally doesn't know much about space and doesn't particularly care. And this trend is similar in the US and in Europe. This poses a serious challenge. Countries aiming to use space for geopolitical power, whether democratic or not, are constrained by public indifference. So it's not surprising that governments might turn to familiar Cold War style tactics, which means that they might invoke rivalry and threat to justify further space investments. So why should we care about whether political leaders use geopolitical comparative rhetoric in the context of space? There are several reasons, and none of them is actually trivial. So first, this kind of rhetoric can fuel xenophobia. By framing space exploration as a zero-sum contest between nations, leaders risk reinforcing nationalist sentiments rather than encouraging a shared human endeavor. Second, geopolitical comparative rhetoric can undermine international cooperation. Think International Space Station, one of the most ambitious and successful examples of global scientific collaboration. And projects like this would be far less likely to emerge in an environment dominated by geopolitical outdo. Third, and more subtle, comparative rhetoric can increase what political scientists call audience costs. This means that leaders who hype up international rivalries, especially in high-profile domains like space, may face domestic political backlash if they appear to be losing ground or failing to deliver. In other words, the pressure they create can backfire. So the underlying moral and political question becomes, is the use of geopolitical comparative rhetoric actually worth the cost? But before we can answer that, we need to know whether the strategy of comparative rhetoric actually works. That is, does this kind of rhetoric increase public support for space investing? That brings us to our first research question. How does citizens' approval of an increase in national space budget change if they are presented with geopolitical comparative rhetoric? However, as we mentioned in the introduction, our study investigates two phenomena. And this brings us to the second research question. And to frame it properly, I want to return briefly to the initial Trump quote. And we have to make a little confession here because we tricked you a little bit, or more accurately, we left something out. So let's listen to this quote again. And I'm sorry again for that.
And it came down so gently, and then it wrapped those arms around it, and it held it. And just like you hold your baby at night, your little baby. And it was a beautiful thing to see. And I called Elon. I said, Elon, was that you? He said, yes, it was. I said, who else can do that? Can Russia do it? No. Can China do it? No. Can the United States do it other than you? No.
So as you might have realized, what we didn't emphasize earlier is a crucial part of that quote, one that points to a second equally important phenomenon we are investigating in our article. And in that quote, Trump isn't just using space achievements to compare nations. He's also referencing a private company. And it's not just any company, it's SpaceX, a firm whose technological capabilities and strategic leverage now rival and in some cases even surpass those of entire nation states, including the US. This is not a fringe observation. The geopolitical implications of companies like SpaceX are increasingly recognized in academic policy and defense circles like the one we are currently at. And firms like SpaceX operate launch infrastructure, maintain satellite constellations, and provide services like global broadband and wartime communication, often with minimum public oversight. So in other words, we are not just witnessing a geopolitical contest between nations, we are also seeing the emergence of private actors as geopolitical players. This leads us to our second research question, which Daniel will now derive for you in more detail.
Well, thank you very much, Lars. Obviously, both Lars and I, we are aware that it did not take the rise of the new space economy for space stakeholders to realize that, well, space companies are geopolitical companies. Even, of course, aerospace conglomerates have long been seen as geopolitical assets on one hand, but also as inherently geopolitical companies as they try to shape geopolitics through, for example, lobbying in their favor. And in that sense, they are very similar to other geopolitical companies, such as, for example, oil companies. And we see that not only politicians or company executives have realized that, The finance literature shows that aerospace stocks volatility increases with geopolitical crises, and during the Cold War, satellite launches of adversaries distracted investors away from the stock market. However, and that's the difference, the key difference today is that the rise of the new space economy has put a totally different kind of firm at the forefront of the space industry. And as Lars has already said, the economic and geopolitical importance of these individual firms in part is vastly surpassing that of established aerospace conglomerates. On the slide, you can see the second source there by Whitman Kopp. She wrote a great book called Privatizing Peace that points out these differences in geopolitical powers of old and new space company in much more detail. I can only recommend it. But in any case, what is often forgotten in that story of this whole success of the new space economy is the transition, the institutional transformation that made it possible, the institutional transformation of space agencies. Because historically, NASA and other similar agencies were seen as market fixers, right? Their job was providing a public good that a market wouldn't provide. For example, basic science, national security benefits. But over time, especially in the case of NASA, the criticism grew about the cost and speed of these legacy programs. Oftentimes, as many of you know, cost and speed of a program is very much correlated. But with these programs, the criticism grew, and starting with NASA, agencies are now increasingly shifting towards what Marianne Mazzucato calls market creators or market shapers. And in practice, that means instead of doing everything in-house, contracting out the mere construction of already designed space assets, agencies are now more focused on enabling private actors, as you all know, buying services rather than products, and overseeing infrastructure and setting safety standards. And the great thing is we can actually back this with data, because if you look at the graph, you can see the share of total NASA obligations plotted over time, broken down by contract type and volume. And what we can clearly see is that the share of firm fixed price contracts increased significantly, which is indicative of a space agency working as a market facilitator, because on one hand, it gives the private company more freedom to design a solution, but on the other hand, it also shifts more risk towards the company compared to these more traditional cost-plus contract types. Especially NASA's transformation is widely portrayed as a success, right? There are prominent studies estimating development cost savings in the billions, even though nowadays more newer findings are a bit more nuanced. For example, the study by Moon and Hyde. But nevertheless, there is already a trade-off. For example, the Western launch market for middle and large-sized satellites is basically close to a monopoly, and multiple authors have raised concerns about the lack of consideration for negative externalities. And the thing is, and this is really key, these private companies, they still rely heavily on public space funding, with governments often constituting their main customer group, or governments being crucial for seed funding to then get venture capital funding started. So at the end of the day, public money and therefore public opinion is still fundamental for these new space companies. And research does not really consider this fact and is rather focused on the overall economic and organizational outcomes of the institutional transformation, which is obviously important, right? But it doesn't account for the whole story. And it's what makes it even worse is that initial studies, the few that there are, indicate that citizens are even more skeptical and even less informed about private space companies than they are about space agencies or space in general. Therefore, our second research question is, how does citizens' approval of increasing the national space budget change when it's highlighted that tax revenue is allocated directly to private companies rather than public space agencies? And Lars, you're going to tell us now how we implemented these two research questions.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. So what we did was we ran a pre-registered survey experiment in the 9 top spacefaring countries, which account for over 90% of all public space funding worldwide. So think China, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the US. And the experiment was fielded from the end of April to the beginning of March 2023. So this was the time before, or at the time actually, Elon and Donald were still friends. And so you have to bear this in mind for the results we're going to present you in a second. So we have two treatments, treatment 1 for research question 1 and treatment 2 for research question 2. And we will show you the exact wording of the treatments in a minute. So importantly, the dependent variable is always a Likert scale answer, asking participants, in your opinion, should funding for space exploration in your respective country increase, decrease, or stay the same? And additionally, as an incentivized measure, we also allowed participants to donate some of their money they earned as part of the experiment to a space charity. So we could actually check whether they actually put the money where their mouth was. So we asked multiple control questions as well about space-related policy issues, trying to identify the specific channel of why people support a funding increase for space exploration. And for example, we asked participants about their top priorities and concerns in space and whether they, the respective nation should be participating in a human Mars mission or not. But that's what we did. And for the first treatment, we tried to imitate geopolitical comparative rhetoric. We do so by telling participants the space budget of their own nation and their greatest adversary nations. Obviously, we asked them before what the greatest adversary nation is, and each participant came up, obviously, with a different answer. As we have shown you, previous research indicated that giving people any information about past space budget influences their public opinion. And hence, we also tested how large the effect of simply providing any budget information is. Here's a little spoiler. So like other authors, we also measure an increase in the approval when providing citizens with their national space budget. For research question 1, investigating the impact of comparative rhetoric, what we do, therefore, is we compare treatment path national budget versus national budget plus adversary budget. And this, in fact, allows us to control for providing any information at all about space with comparative rhetoric. For the second treatment, we give participants either information about their national space agency or general information about efficient private companies. So let's go into a little bit more detail here. And here is how we implemented treatment 1, which measures the impact of comparative rhetoric. So what we did was, first of all, as a control group, we didn't give any information at all to participants to see whether the information about the national budget would have an impact at all. So in this condition, we gave participants information on the space budget as a percentage of the overall federal budget. And third, we imitated geopolitical comparative rhetoric by stating the national and the adversary budget to participants. So because simply rectifying misinformation already increases space budget approval, this is why we compared option 2 with option 3 to answer our research question 1. And before we show you the results, you might want to ask yourself, what would be your expectation when comparing option 2 and 3? Sorry, I didn't show you yet. Okay. Okay. And finally, for our second research question, we investigate whether the citizens' approval of increasing the nation's space budget changes when tax revenues are allocated directly to private companies rather than public space agencies. And here we prime participants with either information about the legacy of their national space agency or the efficiency of new space companies without naming any specific company. And to ensure similarity in the treatments, we try to positively connotate both treatments. So let us look at the results, starting with potentially a little surprise.
Well, thank you very much again. As Lars said, before we get into the really interesting results of research question 1, we have to first emphasize that as Lars said, we too measure a simple information effect in line with other authors. So we find a 7 percentage point increase in space budget approval when comparing option 1 and option 2 of treatment 1. So basically telling citizens nothing at all or telling them their national budget. And therefore, as Lars said, the effect sizes that you will now see for research question 1 are always the comparisons between citizens who were provided with their national space budget and the national space budget plus adversary space budget to account for this information effect. Okay, then remember your intuition, and these are the results. Lars? Yeah, thank you. We actually find that providing information about what geopolitical rivals are spending significantly decreases public support by 9 percentage points. And that's obviously the exact opposite of what policymakers are probably intending to do. That very much surprised us because the direction of this funding is also robust against different subsample analyses. For example, the incentivized measure, regardless of whether the citizen stated she really hates her adversary or how important militarization or how much of a problem militarization was for her. The direction of this effect is also the same when we consider citizens who overestimated national or adversary budgets, and if the citizen saw a lower or higher adversary budget. Okay, so that was a huge surprise to us, and obviously we were interested in the why, in the mechanism, right, in the channel, and we believe that the solution to this puzzle lays in this table. The table plots the interaction effect of relative budget size. So basically, if this is your national budget, is your adversary budget higher or lower? And the magnitude in difference basically is your adversary budget much higher or much lower, or is it only slightly higher and slightly lower? And coming to the numbers, we see that people who were confronted with a substantially larger adversary budget reacted the strongest, driving this overall effect. So basically, citizens that were told if the US was their adversary nation, the US is spending so much more than you, these were the people driving the effect. Obviously, the question is then, why on earth would it be rational for people to, for example, for Indians who hear, well, the US is spending so much more on space, why would that make them less likely to want to increase funding for ISRO, right? That really puzzled us, but we now find 2 economic theories that explain this seemingly odd reaction. The first one being a two-lot contest theory. You maybe heard of it when you are trying to model lobbying or arms races, and it's a so-called all-pay winner-take-all contest. Like, for example, the original moon race. All pay means, well, you pay regardless of whether you win and lose, and the winner takes all, so there's one prize and the winner gets the total prize. And some of you maybe have noticed some similarities to lottery. So basically you can increase your chances by buying lottery tickets, in this case, putting in more effort, more space funding. You're not guaranteed to win, but you can make it more likely. And whether you win or lose, your investment is gone, right? The lottery ticket, you've paid for that, and one winner gets the total prize. Coming back to the original moon race, Yuri Gagarin and Laika, that's all nice, but in the end, the US landed on the moon getting the total prize. And the theory suggests that if you as a citizen perceive your country as basically having very little chance against winning against a rival who is spending way more, then it might actually be rational to reduce your support because you minimize the wasted effort while technically still having some tiny non-zero chance of a breakthrough. So basically, you perceive that you only have this one small lottery ticket and everything above that is wasted effort. And the other angle on that is also prospect theory, probably more well known than the two-lot contest, coming from behavioral economics, explaining how we evaluate risks and losses. And from this perspective, citizens might see increasing the space budget as a certain fiscal loss because the money is gone. And it's gone for only a tiny chance of catching up to a dominant rival. And if that chance is so hopeless, then they prefer to cut their losses, which is in line with prospect theory. And as you maybe have also seen, the effects on the slide before on the table, they were also not symmetrical. So people react more strongly to falling behind than they do to getting further ahead, which is also in line with prospect theory. Coming to the second research question, to the results. First of all, we measure a general indifference. Lars? Yeah, thank you. A general indifference in 8 of the 9 countries we've surveyed. Citizen support doesn't really change when you mention space agencies or public space agencies or private new space companies. Most citizens just don't really seem to care. However, there is one major exception. I said 8 of 9 countries, the land of the free, the country with the largest space sector. In the US, citizens are 27 percentage points, 27, less likely to support an increase in the national space budget when private companies are mentioned instead of the ones conducting, instead of NASA. So very large effect size. Again, why, right? What could be a potential explanation? And we offer you 3. I think the first one, very obvious, right? NASA's brand power. NASA had decades to build a reservoir of trust and goodwill. It's associated with historic achievements, as Lars said, right? The Law newspaper in the beginning of this presentation. And new space companies, even the successful ones, just don't have that same deep-rooted history or even emotional connection with the public yet. And maybe you've heard a marketing course in your studies, and then you know brand loyalty can be indeed very, very powerful. Second, a potential channel could be the perception of efficiency. And that sounds paradoxical, but if you as a citizen really believe, well, these private companies, they are more efficient, they can do the same job for less money, well, then what would be your rational choice if you want to keep your space activities at the current level? Well, you reduce funding because you say they can do it with less money. They can do the same stuff with less money. And therefore, it could be seen as a vote of confidence in private efficiency, which then ironically leads to a reluctance to give them more funding. And the third and last explanation, maybe also very obvious, we call it the founder effect. Maybe we could have called it the Musk effect. And the idea here is being that these high-profile space companies are associated with high-profile individuals, which some people might not like. And these negative feelings about these individuals, they then taint the perception of the entire space industry. And as Lars has already said, we collected our data before Musk endorsed Trump. And you might remember that the treatment didn't even mention specific company names, like, for example, SpaceX. Okay, so what to do with these findings? What are the potential implications? So I think for research question 1, very straightforward. Given the cost and given the effect that we measure, the effect going in the opposite direction as intended, the takeaway for leaders is here that this old playbook of fear and rivalry, at least in space, is actively undermining the very support they are trying to build. Coming to the second research question, the enthusiasm that we all have here in this seminar does not really prevail with citizens about the new space economy. However, we could also frame it in a sense that besides in the US, we do not measure any real resistance against this institutional transformation towards new space companies. People just don't care. However, we cannot positively interpret the findings for US new space companies. As I said before, right, it could be tacit approval in other nations in the US. That is highly unlikely because we have this large effect size. And on one hand, we see this as a wake-up call for company executives who heavily rely on government funding. And on the other hand, the politicians that need these new space companies to exert effort in a two-log race at a very low cost, they should also adjust their campaigning accordingly to really gain the benefits that these new space companies offer. And with that, Lars, I believe it's your turn to wrap up this presentation already. Well in time, as you said, Joanna, the Germans.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel. So what did we do? We conducted a survey experiment across 9 major spacefaring countries to examine how both geopolitical rhetoric and the growing role of private space companies influence public support for national space budgets. And we found that when people are exposed to comparative geopolitical rhetoric, like framing space as a race between nations, they tend to reduce their support for public space funding. This suggests that there may be a downside to using that kind of rhetoric. Overall, respondents in our sample didn't show a strong preference between public and private leadership in space efforts. They were largely indifferent, except for the US. despite being at the forefront of the commercial space sector, people were actually less willing to fund private companies than government space programs, even when told that private firms could be more efficient. And I think Daniel gave a lot of explanations why that might be the case. And finally, new space companies in the US and the politicians who support them will thus have a hard time gaining the same public trust and support that NASA has received in the past if they can do it at all. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your attention. Feel free to download the working paper. I put you a QR link on the left-hand side. The paper is currently under review. If you're the referee, do not hesitate to download the podcast if you do not have time, and which summarizes the paper, I hope, pretty neatly. And if you want to know what potential strategies could lead to people being more willing to spend public money on space, check out our paper called What Do Citizens Expect from Space, which we published in Acta Astronautica just, I think, this month or next month, and where we analyze the priorities and concerns of citizens regarding space. Also, feel free to connect with both of us on LinkedIn or via email. And again, thank you very much for having the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you, Daniel, for being so promptly on time, because that really allows us to go through some of the questions. You were busy presenting, but there was a lot of debate going on in the chat. And so I will start with Michelle. Would you like to make your comment and question? I know you got some answers from the audience, but would you like to pose the same questions to Lars or and Daniel? And if yes, so you can speak your question now, or if you're happy with the answers you received in the chat, we can go on to the next questions. Michelle, are you still Michelle Mello, who asked the question about Brazil?
She just wrote that her mic isn't working in the chat. She just
Okay,
wrote that.
so basically she was asking something that we hear quite often, which is, the comment was, why increase the budget of space if we have bigger problems such as health? And she was talking about the Brazilian Space Agency, which has a weak public support. Would you like to comment a little bit on her point, because that is an argument that you hear quite often in the public policy space.
Yeah, maybe or do you want to start, Lars?
As you wish. Like I can only give the economist's answer.
That's what we're looking for. Yeah.
Which is usually to say, like, I mean, as economists, we know what efficiency is, right? And if you want to know which policies you want to follow from an normative standpoint, I think this is up to politicians, right? And but if you decide that space might be the way to go, then we could tell you whether there's an efficient way to do it and how in our experiment get the support. Plus, I think we must not forget that there will also be spillovers to other sectors, including medicine and health, right, that come from space. Daniel also worked on a paper about this. And but yeah, I think there's not much more an economist can say about that.
Okay. I see also Anthony Da Costa made some comments and asked for more thoughts about it. Anthony, can you access your mic, or should I read your comment out loud? Okay, I can read it. If there is a problem with the mics, we'll figure out a way to.
No problem with my mic. No.
Good. Okay, go ahead, please.
No, I don't want to, it's just that, I'm not a technical economist. So obviously, what you're trying to do is create a very sort of robust way of capturing the information and then processing it, and then to draw some conclusions out of it. Now, it looks very neat and clean and sound to me. But I think whenever you start talking about preferences, I think we are in this very messy world. I mean, now if one were to ask Mr. Trump what he thought about the space program, he might have some weird things to say, but you and I would never expect to anticipate. I mean, I think that's the problem. So, but I think there is this question about the U.S. versus the others, and I think they can be divided into those two very broad sort of segments. And the US is a very unique experience compared to the others. Now, there might be some overlap. EU might be coming a little bit closer to the US. But countries like Brazil and India, yeah, I mean, I don't think the public is really, very concerned. On the other hand, some governments, the regimes matter here. In other words, what is the government, how is the government trying to mobilize its sort of support? And it need not be with space, but it can use space to mobilize that support. So I think that there are some lot of nuances in this process of generating preferences and then, of course, understanding those preferences.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
A short comment on the preferences. You're absolutely right that, as you said, right, stated preferences are obviously always superior to revealed preferences, which is why we, for example, in terms of their capacity, in terms of their implications, which is why we, for example, also use an incentivized measure, but the results stay more or less the same. As a short comment to that, maybe. You had a second point. The second point being that the second point was that you're saying that the US is really a special situation, but especially in the private sense that was true. But in the first research question, we didn't really see a difference in nations. So the effect was consistent over nations. That maybe as a short input there. You are right with the public and private one, but for research question one, we actually found very similar things across nations.
Thank you, Daniel. And Nabil, I see that there was a back and forth about certain issues in the chat, but he did ask I think a pertinent question. Would you like to also ask it on the mic, or should I read it? About the relevance of space in people's life and how it shapes public support. Okay, I will read it. So this is part of a longer conversation. Oh yeah, well, go ahead, please, Nabil. Yes.
Right. Sorry. Okay, thank you so much for the time. I think one of the key points here that I find very interesting is actually finding out that perhaps there are gaps here in the sense that space isn't really experienced in daily life as it is versus to scholars or business people from business backgrounds or politicians of their own roles that have relevance in space, and therefore it impacts how the policy making itself happen in each country. I think one of the key things why I ask, does the relevance of how space is experienced in daily life, be it education, pop culture, or etc., impacts how the public support is given to any certain level of policy regarding space? Because one of the key things here is that it's mentioned that the reaction of the public changes in the survey, whether or not, let's say, adversary is mentioned, budget is mentioned, or when it's the role of, let's say, NASA or ESA is mentioned. Therefore, when it is not mentioned at all, doesn't that imply that in each it relies on each individual's understanding of space and how relevant it is to their life that relates to how much they were willing to support for space? Thank you.
Maybe I can answer on this. I mean, the one thing is what we also showed was that even in the US during the time of the moon landing, people were not much in favor of putting funds into space, except for the year of the moon landing. So you have to make it very salient, right? And to give you an example from finance, right? I mean, even if people are paying with their mobile phones or whatever and have a digital infrastructure on this, they don't really care about this, right? Even they have its everyday life, but I think there's no heartfelt connection to government policies in a direct way, I would say. I mean, I guess it is when it is in the media and it's made public in the media, but by using certain technology, I mean, even if you use a certain technology that has been developed by a space mission, think about a certain pen or something that was developed in this way. Like, I don't think that you think about it, right? And yeah, I'm not so hopeful on that. Yeah, sorry for that.
Maybe one thing to add on that, there's this study, and we also quoted, I think, Lehman and I, they actually in the 2010s surveyed the UK and asked how interesting is space. People basically said they do not care, and then the most watched TV programs, scientific TV programs in that year were all space programs. So some TV shows related to space. So even though this was the most watched show, in the end, when you ask them, do you care? No, they don't.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel and Lars. Eli, I see that you also have a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
I'm sorry
please.
I'm not on video. I'm traveling. I found the results super interesting, and I guess just stepping back from the pure economics and political science of it, in terms of what it means for policy. I mean, I think even in your answer to your last question, you discussed how the actual salience might be very different in a small 2,000 person focus group and what policymakers are able to communicate in the real world through public scientific messaging or political communication. And I wonder either, just your own thoughts or drawing on the literature, basically, what does all this mean for what we should actually do if we're trying to increase support for space funding? How can you take these findings, which are very interesting and statistically significant, but in an extremely specific context, and then translate them into something that NASA should do, and then how would we measure it? Thanks a lot.
Well, I think one of the two key things that I believe are most work the best. First of all, there was already an effort. I think it was called A Penny for NASA, which basically said 1% of the federal budget, one penny of the dollar goes to NASA. I think this is exactly the right way to show people how less we are actually spending on civil space at least. And second of all, coming to the paper that Lars mentioned, the Acta Astronautica one, we actually see that the space agencies are already playing the card that seems to convince most citizens, which is monitoring key parts of Earth climate. That's basically, if you ask citizens, what do you want to do in space? That's basically the top priority. So I believe the ways are already the right one, or the topics being played are already the right ones. I think you just have to play them over and over. But Lars, feel free to add on that.
Yeah, most importantly, don't do what Trump is doing. And I mean, generally, but in this sense, like, don't do this comparative rhetoric, right? So that at least in our experiment didn't play out that well in terms of gaining support, right? I mean, that was a major finding of the survey experiment.
Thank you. Louise, I see you have a question about competition versus rivalry. Would you like to ask that on the mic? Do you want me to read it?
No, sure. Thank you.
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting. I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist. I was just, when I read the paper, I didn't find the word rivalry in there. I apologize. And Lars, when he was presenting today, said it at least 3 or 4 times. And as a political scientist, for me, those are two different things. You can have international rivalry, international competition for primacy, for example, as the United States did with Japan in the 80s and 90s and with the European Union, but within a set of rules, right, that we would call international order, rules and norms. But rivalry usually entails something quite different, contesting the existing rules and norms. And I'm just wondering, and maybe it's a bit pedantic, but are you assuming in your study that these are the same things, or are they different? Because if they are different, they are going to have clear policy implications, because when you're competing within a set of rules and you can apply one policy. If it's in terms of rivalry, in an international rivalry, and you're competing for different rules and norms at the international level, that might have clear implications. And you see that playing out already in the commercial sector, because the Artemis Accords have one model for the commercial sector, whereas, for example, the International Lunar Research Station has a very different one. So I'm wondering, is this a model that you would think could be applied generically, or is it very focused on US, Europe?
Lars or Daniel?
Very good point. Very good question. I guess the only thing I can say, I'm glad we didn't mix it up in the paper. So the paper is probably more consistent than what we presented today. But I haven't really thought about this. But yeah, that's a very good point. I have to think about it more. I don't have a clear-cut answer on that. Yeah.
So that's the value of having these multidisciplinary seminars, of getting also the political scientists to pitch in on the economics papers. Jeffrey Wagner had a question. Would you like to ask it on mic?
Sure, thank you.
Please.
So I didn't think of this when I read the paper last week, but I thought of it during the conversation in the presentation, which is another theory of your result one might be that when people hear that other folks have invested heavily in a pure public good, they would rationally try to free ride. So, right, if the citizens believe that much of the space exploration is a public good, that whatever Russia learns, whatever the US learns, whatever anybody learns in their space exploration will benefit us all, then the classic public good model is that the individuals, particularly who are budget constrained, are going to look for opportunities to free ride. So that's one comment. Second comment is that there's a lot of literature on how people significantly misunderstand fundamentals. So in the law and economics literature, for instance, you see lots of cases where people overestimate small probabilities and they underestimate big probabilities. And so then the final observation is I think that people are basically losing faith in spillover benefits. And you see this not only in the space exploration, but in higher education and in health research, basic science, and also in the arts. And so I think in all of those cases, the unifying feature is that we have always believed and maintained and tried to measure significant external benefits that warrant public support. My sense is, having 60 years of observation now as a voter citizen, is that a lot of people I talk with no longer believe that that's the case. And hence one consequence is that schools like University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and University of Michigan are now more and more like private universities because the public support for the external benefit seems no longer true. Thank you.
Thank you. Lars or Daniel, would you like to respond to this, or you're okay with
I think so. The first comment on the public good, I think, is very valuable again. I think we did not really consider that, and we should in any case. However, I would argue with you with the positive externalities with the spillover aspect, because I honestly believe with the low salience in space or about space at the moment, I think they're going to first think about 20 other things that you can do in space, and then they can think of spillovers, even though it's a valid strategy of arguing for space, saying, hey, these and that spillovers are occurring. I'm not quite certain, but I do not have data on that, but I'm not quite certain that they are actually thinking about it, even though the argument in itself is valid. But in space, not so sure.
Sure.
Just a brief response on the public good. I mean, then the question is, I mean, what do you mean in like free riding, right? I mean, do you mean free riding that in one nation some citizens pay for it and others don't? Or do you mean that one nation free rides on other nations? Because I think the latter is probably not going to take place, because I don't think that we see Europeans anytime soon on a Chinese space station or something like this and to free ride on that. So I think that's not going to happen. And then the thing is, like, free riding, would that even be possible within a nation? Because if you tax them in terms of value added tax or something like this, you cannot get out, right? I mean, you're paying for that anyway.
No, I was thinking of free riding in the sense that as we send people to space and they do experiments, and the experiments are published in peer-reviewed studies and they're picked up by Wall Street Journal and New York Times and that sort of thing. Those results trickle down to lots of people that have not paid. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your comments, Jeffrey, and also to Lars and Daniel for answering. I know there are far more questions in the chat, but we will attempt to be Germans today and finalize at the time we promised to finalize. First of all, I like to thank all of you that we were 80 at some point who join us in this first seminar. I hope to really see you again next month on October 21st when Eli from Harvard Kennedy School will present his work on space-based solar power. We will make the paper available online before the seminar like we did now. And I want you to think about this seminar as sort of like a pilot season, like with a TV series. If it's successful and proven useful to the community, we'll have a second season next year. So I hope to see you again in the following weeks and to have these constructive feedbacks to the papers. Also, I wanted to say that probably some of us are going to be all in Sydney in a few weeks. So I'll be in touch by email with a possible in-person meetup in Sydney if you would like to follow up with a conversation face-to-face. And with that, well, thank you. And I guess I see you in October, unless some of my colleagues want to add something at the end.
Thanks, Ioana. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much. Very much looking forward to this.
Thank you.